Meghan Markle's Netflix dream has turned into an absolute nightmare, and it's all unfolding in real time. What was once promoted as a powerful, inspiring project has spiraled into one of the most embarrassing flops the platform has ever seen. From creative clashes to public backlash, Meghan's tight grip on the series has slipped through her fingers, and now Netflix is doing everything it can to distance itself from the mess. Here's how it all unraveled, and why it's not over yet. When Hollywood's golden deal began to rot. It all began with flashing cameras and polished PR statements in the autumn of 2020, when Netflix and Meghan Markle announced their ambitious new partnership. At the time, the media couldn't get enough of it. An American duchess stepping into Hollywood not as a supporting player, but as a creator, with vision, control, and an ironclad contract. The deal, reportedly worth tens of millions, was heralded as a win for every. Netflix would tap into Meghan and Harry's global fame, while the couple, newly distanced from royal life, would craft their own narrative in a way Buckingham Palace never allowed. But as with so many things in Hollywood, the sparkle faded fast. Meghan's first major project under the deal, With Love, Meghan, was billed as a heartfelt, empowering stories meant to showcase inspiring stories and reflect her authentic voice. In theory, it was a perfect match for Netflix's growing catalog of feel-good content. But from the very start, insiders reported friction behind the scenes. Meghan wanted full creative control, not just over the broad themes, but over the tiniest production details. She picked directors, shaped the script language, influenced costume choices, and dictated camera angles. That level of control would have been demanding for any producer, let alone one without a deep background in television production. And as months rolled by, it became clear to Netflix's internal teams that the project wasn't shaping into the bold, emotional hit they had hoped for. Instead, it was slowly unraveling. Staff members described the work environment as stifling. Meetings ran long and ended with little progress. Producers began dreading calls with Meghan's team, who were notorious for changing direction at the last minute. But Netflix, committed to their golden investment, pressed forward. They finished the first batch of episodes, packaged it as season 1, and quietly hoped the second half, what Meghan insisted on calling season 2, would fare better. They had no idea the worst was yet to come. The season that wasn't a season at all. From the outside, Meghan Markle's Netflix project seemed to be picking up momentum. With glowing press releases and industry whispers of creative brilliance, With Love, Meghan was supposed to be a crown jewel in the streaming giant's content lineup. But internally, Netflix executives were beginning to feel uneasy. The root of that tension lay in a quiet but significant disagreement. Meghan's insistence on calling the second half of the series Season 2. The problem? There was no Season 2. From the very beginning, Netflix had commissioned a single run of episodes, essentially one long season, shot all at once and then split into 2 parts for release. But Meghan had different plans. She believed that calling the second batch a full-fledged second season would lend the show legitimacy. It would make it appear like a successful series that had earned a renewal, signaling to audiences and the industry alike that she had created something worth continuing. Internally, this raised serious alarms. Greg Peters, Netflix's CEO, and other senior leaders were particularly troubled by the implications. Framing the release as a new season when no such decision had been made felt like misleading the public, and more dangerously, misleading shareholders. At first, some executives turned a blind eye, allowing the language to be used in early marketing materials to avoid rocking the boat. But after the disastrous test screenings that followed, the tolerance for misrepresentation vanished completely. The directive came down, hard and fast: remove all references to a second season. From this point forward, it would be known only as Part 2 of the original project. The illusion of success had to be torn down before it caused any more damage. This decision sparked outrage in Meghan's camp. Sources said she felt humiliated, arguing that the show needed the optics of a second season to maintain momentum. But Netflix was no longer entertaining optics. They were focused on salvaging their investment. What had started as a subtle branding disagreement had exploded into a crisis of credibility. The label wasn't just misleading, it was now symbolic of a deeper issue. Meghan wanted to project growth. Netflix saw collapse. The test screening that changed everything. For Netflix, internal test screenings are routine, an essential step used to gauge audience reaction, fine-tune content, and catch any missteps before a public release. But when episode 8 of With Love, Meghan was shown to Netflix's own curated audience panel in early 2023, what came back wasn't just criticism. It was an emergency. This wasn't the kind of minor, fixable feedback producers typically expect. It was catastrophic. Multiple viewers reportedly stopped watching halfway through. Others labeled the episode unwatchable, citing stiff performances, confusing tone, and a finale that felt both emotionally hollow and painfully self-indulgent. Meghan's acting, which she had hoped would be a triumphant return to her storytelling roots, was called out as overly rehearsed, even disingenuous. But the most repeated word across all feedback forums was fake. Not in the sense of fabricated facts or fictionalized events, but in the emotional sense. Audiences felt nothing because they didn't believe anything. They saw a performance wrapped in a brand, not a vulnerable human being. And for a show that had been marketed as deeply authentic, that was the kiss of death. Greg Peters was notified of the results within hours. His response was immediate. A board-level meeting was called, and in that meeting, one thing became non-negotiable. Meghan Markle would be stripped of all creative control, effective immediately. She would no longer have script approval, no say in editing, and no role in shaping the remaining episodes. From that moment on, Meghan's influence on the series ended. This was not just a creative shift, it was a corporate rescue mission. Internally, Netflix staff described the atmosphere as tense but relieved. For months, they had struggled with conflicting directives, chaotic revisions, and inconsistent vision. Now, there was clarity. The top brass had finally acknowledged what many already knew. The project was falling apart, and Meghan was no longer the one to fix it. And yet, even as Netflix executives worked to salvage what they could, another deeper issue began to emerge. Meghan's fingerprints weren't just on a few scripts or scenes. They were embedded in every corner of the show, and pulling her out wouldn't be as easy as it seemed. A vision that couldn't be untangled. Once the decision was made to remove Meghan Markle from the creative process, Netflix executives believed they could regain control of the series, but what they quickly discovered was far more troubling. Meghan's influence wasn't limited to the scripts or a few scenes here and there. Her creative DNA was deeply woven into the entire production. From the themes and tone to the way camera shots were framed, the pacing of the dialogue, even the style of guest interactions. It all screamed Meghan. She hadn't just contributed to the project, she had engineered it from top to bottom, and now, trying to separate the show from her vision was like trying to extract dye from fabric. The color had set. Producers tasked with cleaning up the mess were horrified at how entangled things had become. Meghan had guided the direction of the narrative so forcefully that even scenes without her presence carried her voice. Editorial teams began to notice that the transitions between interviews and monologues were scripted more like speeches than conversations. Scripted to reflect a version of Meghan that, by now, everyone internally referred to as the brand. Not the person, not the storyteller, the brand. And that brand, once considered a global asset, had become a liability. What had started as a promising blend of personal memoir and inspirational storytelling had morphed into something unrecognizable. Instead of drawing viewers in with quiet honesty, the show now felt like a calculated image piece. There were no vulnerable moments, no organic exchanges. It was glossy, heavily produced, and, according to internal reviewers, emotionally empty. Meghan wanted to inspire, but the audience saw a lecture dressed in soft lighting. Even worse, the parts that were originally supposed to ground the show, her humanitarian efforts, behind-the-scenes looks at real-world visits, were edited in ways that felt disconnected from the show's message. It was as if she had lost touch with the average viewer. And while Netflix's original gamble had been that Meghan's authenticity would bridge that gap, the reality was much colder. Her vision was no longer relatable, and attempting to fix it without gutting the entire production became a logistical nightmare. The scene that broke the trust. Among the many creative battles that erupted during the unraveling of With Love Meghan, one scene came to symbolize the entire collapse. Meghan had strongly advocated for including a segment early in Part 2 that showed her visiting a fire station in Los Angeles. To her, it was a moment of truth, a chance to connect with first responders, show humility, and display genuine compassion. She envisioned it as a centerpiece of the narrative, a grounding image of herself not as a duchess or a celebrity, but as an everyday citizen standing beside real heroes. At first, Netflix agreed to include it. The footage was shot, edited, and even scheduled to lead the new season, or what Meghan continued to call a new season, despite Netflix's firm rebranding to Part 2. But as the series continued to implode, the fire station scene was pulled under scrutiny. Internally, producers questioned its authenticity. They noted how the segment, though intended to be heartfelt, came off as staged and overly polished. It didn't align with the raw, vulnerable tone the show was now desperate to reclaim. Executives worried that audiences would see through it instantly and view the moment as a calculated PR stunt. So they made a decision. The footage would be cut completely, not just quietly. Meghan was formally notified that her chosen scene, one she believed essential to the emotional arc, would not be part of the final release. The reaction was explosive. Sources inside Netflix said Meghan was livid, accusing the platform of sabotaging her message and undermining her creative voice. She fought the removal, insisting the scene was vital to the narrative. But by this point, Netflix was no longer negotiating. The show had become a crisis, and crisis management required swift, unsentimental decisions. The scene stayed deleted. This single moment represented more than a creative disagreement. It revealed the total erosion of trust between Meghan and Netflix. What had once been a collaborative relationship was now a power struggle. And as more decisions were made without her input, it became clear that Meghan's voice, once the loudest in the room, was being systematically silenced. $7 million gone, and so was the dream. By the time With Love, Meghan was deep into damage control. Netflix executives faced a harsh financial reality. The budget was spiraling out of control, and the return on investment looked bleaker by the day. Originally positioned as a flagship series, the show had already cost tens of millions to produce, but with poor internal feedback, a fractured production team, and a marketing disaster looming, Netflix made a move that stunned even insiders. They slashed the reshoot budget by a staggering $7 million. This wasn't a trim around the edges, it was a surgical strike meant to stop the bleeding. Key scenes originally slated for refilming, including the finale of episode 8, were either rewritten to require less production time or scrapped entirely. Directors were instructed to prioritize efficiency over elegance. In less polite terms, get it done and get it done fast. The original vision of a glossy, cinematic, prestige-style documentary was officially dead. The mood on set turned cold. Crew members who had once believed in the project began requesting reassignment. Several senior editors reportedly walked away mid-sessions, unwilling to attach their names to what had now become, in their words, a salvage operation. Even the directors brought in for reshoots were told their mandate was not excellence, it was damage control. Where the show had once aimed to move people emotionally, the new goal was simply to avoid further embarrassment. Meghan predictably was furious. Sources close to the production say she was blindsided by the scale of the cuts. In her view, the show wasn't just a creative effort, it was personal. Every deleted scene, every downgraded shot felt like an attack on her character, but Netflix no longer had time for emotional appeals. From their perspective, this was a failed investment that needed to be closed out with as little financial fallout as possible. The $7 million cut became symbolic. It marked the official turning point where, with love, Meghan went from a high-stakes media venture to a burden Netflix couldn't wait to offload. The dream had not only soured, it had collapsed under its own weight. The Meghan-free marketing makeover. As the wreckage of With Love, Meghan piled up behind the scenes, Netflix turned its attention to the only thing left within its control: how the series would be marketed. With Meghan Markle effectively removed from the creative process and internal confidence in the show at an all-time low, the company faced a decision. Either lean into the scandal and risk further backlash, or quietly begin distancing the entire brand from Meghan herself. They chose the latter, and they did so with precision. In what insiders described as a coordinated pivot, all marketing materials for Part 2 of the series were systematically reworked. Meghan's face, once the focal point of posters and promotional graphics, was gradually minimized. Trailers were recut to reduce her screen time, shifting the focus to peripheral characters, setting shots, and narrative themes that didn't rely so heavily on her presence. Thumbnail images for the platform were swapped out for more neutral visuals. Even the press releases began using colder, more generic language. Meghan was no longer described as the visionary behind the show. She was simply listed as a cast member. In internal meetings, executives no longer referred to her as a partner. The new term was contractual obligation. For a woman who had once commanded headlines and driven global intrigue, this quiet erasure was brutal. Meghan's team noticed immediately. Sources say they pushed back hard, contacting Netflix's marketing department with complaints and urgent corrections, arguing that the promotional pivot misrepresented her role. But by then, the momentum had shifted too far. Netflix wasn't just rebranding the show, they were actively rebranding away from Meghan. This wasn't about ego, it was about survival. The message was clear without needing to be said publicly. Netflix had lost faith, and the streaming platform was not about to waste another dollar or another headline on a star who had gone from media darling to PR disaster in less than 3 years. The Meghan-free marketing wasn't just a strategy, it was the beginning of a quiet exile, one designed to help audiences forget the name that once sold the deal in the first place. When Netflix turned on its own deal, what began as a calculated risk in late 2020 had by mid-2024 become an internal liability so severe that Netflix's executive board was no longer just cleaning up a mess, they were investigating how the mess happened in the first place. For a company known for its strategic partnerships and tight creative oversight, the unraveling of With Love, Meghan triggered a level of corporate introspection rarely seen in public-facing media giants. The question being asked behind closed doors wasn't, how do we fix this? It was, who let it go this far? Greg Peters, who had championed the Meghan deal early on, found himself under increasing scrutiny. At the time of the partnership's launch, Peters had framed it as a bold step toward modern storytelling. He believed Meghan's personal journey, combined with her royal notoriety, could draw in new demographics and elevate Netflix cultural capital. But as the second half of the series began collapsing, both in content and in perception, that original optimism looked less like foresight and more like failure. High-ranking members of the board began demanding a post-mortem. Internal memos circulated assessing every point of creative control Meghan had been given, from script rewrites to guest appearances to directorial decisions. The findings were damning. Meghan hadn't just influenced the show, she had shaped it to such a degree that no one else's voice could break through. And worse, no one in a decision-making role had stepped in early enough to correct course. To avoid repeating the same mistakes, Netflix quietly updated internal policy. Future celebrity partnerships would now undergo heightened scrutiny. New clauses would limit editorial autonomy, even for high-profile names. A dedicated oversight committee was rumored to be in the works, specifically to prevent another situation where branding ambitions overtook storytelling fundamentals. Meghan Markle, who had once symbolized Netflix's bold future, was now being discussed in internal training documents as a cautionary tale. The shift was staggering, but it was also intentional. Hollywood has always had a short memory for failure, but Netflix was determined to ensure theirs came with lessons that would not be forgotten. When the audience walked away, as Netflix scrambled to rebrand With Love, Meghan behind the scenes, the real litmus test came not from critics or executives, but from everyday viewers. In regions where Meghan Markle's name once guaranteed global headlines, the data painted a very different story. Audience engagement was not only low, it was dropping rapidly. Internal analytics from the United Kingdom and the United States, two of the platform's most strategically important territories, showed that interest in the series had collapsed before Part 2 even aired. There was no buzz, no anticipation, just quiet indifference. And worse than indifference, there was resentment. Feedback from international surveys described the series as out of touch, preachy, and self-serving. Viewers were tired, not just of Meghan's presence in the media, but of the narrative she kept trying to push. One response summarized the mood perfectly. "We're not here to be lectured by someone who lives in a mansion and calls it struggle." The series had promised vulnerability and relatability. Instead, audiences saw branding. Instead of truth, they saw a performance. For Netflix, this was a wake-up call louder than any internal boardroom warning. The public was no longer emotionally invested in Meghan Markle as a figure, and the series failed to change that. Instead of reigniting public curiosity, it confirmed a growing suspicion that Meghan was no longer speaking for people, she was speaking at them. The very demographic she had hoped to win over with the show had tuned her out. This wasn't just a problem for With Love, Meghan, it was a problem for the entire deal. The entire purpose of the partnership was to leverage Meghan's notoriety into viewership and engagement. But now, her name seemed to actively repel potential audiences. Every dollar spent on marketing became harder to justify. Every poster with her image became a question mark. How had someone so culturally relevant just a few years earlier lost the room so completely? Netflix didn't have the answer, but the numbers made one thing clear: the audience had moved on, and they weren't looking back. The silent farewell and Meghan's final reality check. By the summer of 2025, it was obvious to everyone at Netflix that the Meghan Markle experiment had come to its end. There would be no grand finale, no red carpet premiere, no talk show appearances or glowing press tours to mark the release of With Love, Meghan Part 2. Instead, Netflix executives made a quiet decision behind closed doors. Let the remaining episodes drop without fanfare. With the opening episode show fanfare, no media blitz, no curated interviews, just a discreet upload to the platform in September, followed by complete and deliberate silence. For Meghan, this ending was not just anticlimactic, it was devastating. Sources close to her say she felt betrayed, deeply wounded by how the project had been handled. She had once seen With Love, Meghan, as her masterpiece, a statement to the world that she could thrive creatively outside the royal family's constraints. But instead, she was sidelined, ignored, and eventually removed from the conversation entirely. Internally, Netflix had already moved on. Her pitches for future documentaries had been shelved. Talks of spin-offs or follow-ups were quietly terminated. And while no public statement would be made, those closest to the matter confirmed what had already become clear: Netflix was done with Meghan Markle. Executives were already focusing resources on new talent, fresh ideas, and far less controversial partnerships. Meghan, once hailed as a modern media icon, was now viewed as a cautionary tale, proof that notoriety does not guarantee success, and that control, when unchecked, can destroy even the most promising projects. Her vision had been too curated, too sanitized, and ultimately too disconnected from the audience she thought she understood. Behind the scenes, morale within her team plummeted. PR strategies failed to shift the narrative, leaked insider scoops about production sabotage fell flat. Meghan's refusal to accept responsibility only deepened the damage. She had tried to control the story, but in doing so, she lost the plot. And in Hollywood, that kind of mistake is rarely forgiven. Now, as Netflix quietly distances itself from the entire ordeal, Meghan faces the harshest ending of all. Not a scandal, not a firing, but a cold, quiet erasure. And in the world of entertainment, that silence speaks louder than any headline ever could.